For 88 years, Jerusalem was lost. Then Saladin took it back, and the people inside the city were terrified, because the last time Jerusalem changed hands, thousands were slaughtered. Now the Crusaders expected the same fate. The gates would soon open, the city would soon surrender, and one man would decide what happened next. Would Saladin take revenge? Or would he do something no conqueror was expected to do? The answer would make him one of the most respected rulers in history. But before Jerusalem fell, a kingdom had to collapse. To understand why the fall of Jerusalem mattered so much, you have to understand what the city represented. This was not just another medieval city. It was one of the most sacred places on earth. For Christians, Jerusalem was the city of Jesus. For Muslims, it was home to Al-Aqsa Mosque, the site associated with the Prophet Muhammad's night journey. For Jews, it was the location of the ancient temple and the spiritual heart of their history. Few places in the world carried such enormous religious significance. And that significance made Jerusalem far more than a political prize. It became a symbol, a city claimed by faith, memory, and identity. In 1099, during the First Crusade, European Crusader armies reached Jerusalem after a long and brutal campaign across the Middle East. When the city fell, the victory shocked the Islamic world. For Christians in Europe, it was celebrated as a miraculous triumph. For Muslims, it was a catastrophe. A sacred city had been lost. And for the first time in centuries, Jerusalem was ruled by a Christian kingdom. The Crusaders established the Kingdom of Jerusalem and transformed the city into the center of their power in the Holy Land. At first, many believed Muslim rulers would quickly reclaim it. But that never happened. Years passed, then decades. The Islamic world was divided. Rival rulers fought one another. Dynasties competed for influence, while Jerusalem remained in Crusader hands. Children were born, grew old, and died knowing only a Crusader Jerusalem. Entire generations lived and passed without seeing the city return. As time went on, many people began to wonder whether it ever would. The Crusader kingdom survived crisis after crisis. Survived wars. It survived invasions. It survived rulers who swore they would destroy it. Again and again, Jerusalem remained beyond reach. Yet despite the setbacks, the dream never disappeared. Across the Muslim world, scholars spoke about Jerusalem. Poets wrote about Jerusalem. Rulers dreamed about Jerusalem. The city remained a wound that never fully healed. And nearly 90 years after its loss, a new leader was beginning to believe that reclaiming it might finally be possible. His name was Saladin, and unlike many rulers before him, he understood that Jerusalem would never be won by passion alone. It would require something far more difficult: unity. By the middle of the 12th century, the dream of reclaiming Jerusalem still existed. But dreams alone could not win wars. For decades, one problem had prevented Muslim rulers from seriously challenging the Crusader states: division. The Islamic world was powerful, but it was not united. Egypt followed one ruler. Syria followed another. Local dynasties competed for influence. Alliances shifted constantly. And while Muslim leaders argued among themselves, the Crusader kingdom of Jerusalem survived. That was the world Saladin inherited. He was not born the ruler of a great empire. He was born into a military family and rose through years of service, diplomacy, and warfare. Unlike many ambitious commanders, Saladin understood something crucial. Jerusalem would never be recovered unless the Muslim world stopped fighting itself. So rather than marching directly toward the holy city, he focused on a far more difficult task: bringing rival territories together. The process took years. There were negotiations, political struggles, military campaigns, victories, setbacks. More than once, his enemies believed his growing power could be stopped. Yet Saladin continued expanding his influence. Gradually, Egypt and Syria came under his leadership. For the first time in generations, a large portion of the Muslim world was beginning to act with a common purpose. That changed everything, because now the Crusader kingdom faced something it had rarely faced before: a united opponent. Saladin was patient. He knew that Jerusalem could not be taken simply because he wanted it. The Crusader states still possessed powerful fortresses, experienced knights, and strong defensive positions. If he attacked too soon, he could lose everything. So he waited. He strengthened alliances, built resources, expanded his armies, and watched for the right moment. That moment arrived in 1187. A series of escalating tensions pushed both sides toward open war. The Crusader leadership became divided. Truces collapsed. Old rivalries intensified. Soon, neither side could avoid confrontation. The result was one of the most important battles in medieval history, the Battle of Hattin. There, Saladin achieved what generations of Muslim rulers had failed to accomplish. The main Crusader army was shattered. Many of its most important leaders were captured. The military power that had protected the Kingdom of Jerusalem for decades suddenly collapsed. The road to the Holy City was finally open. News spread rapidly across the region. Fortresses surrendered. Cities fell. One after another, Crusader strongholds passed into Saladin's hands. And with each victory, the same question grew louder. If the Crusader army was gone, who would defend Jerusalem? Soon, the answer became clear. The city would have to defend itself, because Saladin was coming. By the late summer of 1187, fear was spreading across the Kingdom of Jerusalem. The news arriving from the countryside was impossible to ignore. The Crusader army had been defeated. Major fortresses were surrendering. Cities that had once seemed secure were falling one after another. And wherever the reports came from, they carried the same warning. Saladin was advancing. For the people of Jerusalem, the danger felt increasingly real. Refugees began arriving from across the region. Families crowded through the gates seeking safety. Merchants abandoned their homes. Farmers fled their villages. Nobles brought whatever possessions they could carry. Every new arrival seemed to bring another story of defeat. The city grew more crowded with each passing day. But population was not the same as military strength. Jerusalem needed defenders, and there were very few available. Many experienced knights had been killed or captured at Hattin. Others were scattered across the remaining Crusader territories. The kingdom had lost much of the army that once protected it. The situation became so desperate that men with little military experience were hurriedly armed and organized for the city's defense. It was better than nothing, but everyone understood the reality. If Saladin arrived with his full army, Jerusalem would face overwhelming odds. At the center of the crisis stood a man named Balian of Ibelin. Originally, he had no intention of leading the city's defense. In fact, he had received permission from Saladin to enter Jerusalem briefly in order to retrieve his family. But once inside the city, everything changed. The people begged him to stay. Church leaders begged him to stay. The remaining nobles begged him to stay. Without experienced leadership, Jerusalem's chances of survival would be almost non-existent. Balian faced an impossible choice: honor his agreement and leave, or remain and defend the city. In the end, he stayed. The decision transformed him into the city's most important military leader. Immediately, preparations intensified. Walls were inspected, weapons were distributed, food supplies were organized. Every available defender was assigned a position. The city prepared for a siege. Yet beneath the practical preparations lurked a deeper fear. Many people remembered what had happened in 1099. When the Crusaders captured Jerusalem during the First Crusade, the city had witnessed terrible bloodshed. Now, nearly 90 years later, some feared the same fate awaited them. What would happen if Saladin entered the city? Would there be revenge? Would there be slaughter? Would anyone be spared? No one knew. The uncertainty was terrifying. As September approached, lookouts scanned the horizon daily. Then one day they saw them. Banners, hundreds of them, soon followed by cavalry, infantry, supply trains, and countless soldiers stretching across the landscape. Saladin had arrived. The army that had shattered the Crusader kingdom now stood before Jerusalem itself. From the walls, defenders watched in silence. Many understood they were witnessing a moment that would be remembered for generations. For nearly 90 years, Jerusalem had remained under Crusader rule. Now its future would be decided, and before long, the first attacks would begin. On September 20th, 1187, the siege of Jerusalem began. For nearly 90 years, Crusader banners had flown above the holy city. Now Saladin intended to bring that era to an end. His army surrounded Jerusalem from multiple directions. Campfires appeared across the landscape. Tents covered the hills. Standards bearing Saladin's colors fluttered in the wind. Inside the city, thousands watched from the walls. Many had expected this moment. Now it had arrived. At first, Saladin launched attacks against the western side of the city. His soldiers advanced toward the defenses. Archers exchanged volleys. Siege engines hurled projectiles. The defenders responded with everything they had. Despite their limited numbers, they fought fiercely. Every section of the wall mattered. Every tower mattered. Every day mattered. The defenders understood that survival depended on holding out as long as possible. Perhaps help would come. Perhaps another Crusader army would appear. Perhaps something would change. But as the days passed, no help arrived. Saladin soon realized that some areas of the city's defenses were stronger than others. Rather than waste lives attacking the same positions repeatedly, he adapted. His forces shifted toward weaker sections of the walls. Engineers began concentrating their efforts there. The pressure increased. Day after day, the attacks continued. The defenders resisted, but they could feel the balance slowly changing. The city lacked experienced soldiers. It lacked reserves. And unlike Saladin, it could not replace its losses. Every casualty hurt. Every exhausted defender mattered. Meanwhile, fear spread among the civilian population. The siege was no longer a distant threat. It was happening outside their homes. Families listened to the sounds of fighting beyond the walls. Children watched soldiers preparing for battle. Churches filled with prayers. Rumors spread constantly. Some predicted salvation. Others predicted disaster. No one knew which would come first. Then the situation became even more dangerous. Saladin's engineers began undermining parts of the defenses. The attackers worked to weaken sections of the wall from below. If successful, entire portions could collapse. For the defenders, it was a nightmare. The walls that had protected Jerusalem for decades were beginning to fail. Soon, visible damage appeared. Stones crumbled. Defensive positions became harder to hold. The city was being worn down, not by a single assault, but by relentless pressure. Balian of Ibelin saw the truth clearly. Jerusalem could still fight, but it could not fight forever. The defenders had courage. What they lacked was time. As the days passed, more breaches appeared. More attacks followed. Each one brought Saladin's army closer. Eventually, the reality became impossible to ignore. If the siege continued, the city would fall. The only remaining question was how. Would Jerusalem be taken by storm, or would it surrender first? Balian understood what that question really meant, because if the city was captured by force, thousands of civilians could die. Women, children, the elderly, people with no role in the war. The responsibility weighed heavily on him. He had promised to defend Jerusalem, but he also had a duty to protect the people inside it. As conditions worsened, discussions began. Messengers moved between the two sides. Possibilities were explored. Terms were considered. Yet nothing was guaranteed. The future of Jerusalem still hung in the balance. Outside the walls, Saladin remained patient. He knew victory was close. Inside the walls, Balian faced a decision no commander wanted to make. Continue a fight that could not be won, or negotiate with the man who had come to reclaim the city. The fate of Jerusalem would soon depend on that choice. By late September, the outcome was becoming impossible to deny. Jerusalem could still resist, but it could no longer win. The walls were damaged, the defenders were exhausted, and Saladin's army remained firmly in control of the battlefield. Balian of Ibelin understood the reality. Every additional day of fighting increased the risk of catastrophe. If the city were taken by force, the consequences could be devastating. Thousands of civilians remained trapped inside Jerusalem. Families, religious leaders, merchants, refugees who had fled there seeking safety. All of them would be caught in whatever came next. And so Balian made a decision. He requested negotiations. The request reached Saladin's camp. For the Sultan, it was a remarkable moment. For nearly 90 years, Jerusalem had remained beyond Muslim control. Now the city was finally within reach. Yet despite his advantage, Saladin did not immediately receive an unconditional surrender. The discussions were difficult. Both sides understood the stakes. Both sides understood the history, and history cast a long shadow over every conversation. Nearly 88 years earlier, the Crusaders had captured Jerusalem during the First Crusade. The memory of that event remained powerful throughout the Muslim world. Stories of bloodshed had been passed down for generations. Many people assumed revenge was inevitable. Inside Jerusalem, fear spread rapidly. Citizens whispered about what might happen if the gates opened. Some prepared for the worst. Others prayed for mercy. No one knew what decision Saladin would make. The uncertainty was almost as frightening as the siege itself. Meanwhile, Balian faced an impossible dilemma. If negotiations failed, Jerusalem would likely be stormed. If Jerusalem were stormed, thousands could die. He needed leverage, something that might convince Saladin to accept terms. According to several historical accounts, Balian delivered a stark warning. If no agreement could be reached, the defenders would destroy what remained of the city before surrendering it. They would kill prisoners, destroy property, and continue fighting until nothing remained. Whether every threat could truly have been carried out is debated by historians. But the message was clear. A peaceful surrender would benefit both sides. The negotiations continued. Day after day, representatives moved between the city and Saladin's camp. Neither side wanted the final assault. One feared destruction. The other preferred possession of the city rather than its ruins. Gradually, a compromise began to emerge. Saladin would allow many inhabitants to leave in exchange for ransom payments. Those who could pay would be permitted to depart. Others would require additional arrangements. The discussions were not simple, nor were they perfect, but they offered something that had seemed impossible only days earlier: hope. Inside Jerusalem, word spread quickly. For the first time since the siege began, many citizens believed they might survive. The city was still going to fall. That reality could no longer be avoided, but perhaps its people did not have to fall with it. Soon, the final agreement was reached. The banners would come down. The gates would open. After 88 years of Crusader rule, Jerusalem would return to Muslim control. The moment generations had dreamed about was finally at hand. Yet one question still remained. How would Saladin enter the city? As a conqueror seeking revenge? Or as something very different? That answer would determine how history remembered him. On October 2nd, 1187, the gates of Jerusalem opened. After 88 years of Crusader rule, the holy city surrendered to Saladin. For many inside Jerusalem, it was a moment they had feared for weeks, perhaps even for years. The siege was over. The city had fallen, and now everyone waited to see what would happen next. Would there be revenge? Would there be slaughter? Would the streets witness the same horrors that had followed the Crusader conquest of 1099? Few people knew the answer. Many assumed the worst. The memories of the First Crusades still lingered. Stories of bloodshed had survived for generations. Now history seemed to be offering an opportunity for revenge. Saladin possessed every reason to take it. Yet what followed surprised many observers. The mass slaughter that people feared never came. Instead, arrangements were made for the city's population to leave under agreed terms. Families gathered their belongings. Crowds moved through the streets. Long lines formed near the gates. The process was often difficult. Many people faced uncertainty about their future. Some struggled to pay the required ransom. Others worried about being separated from loved ones. Yet despite the chaos, Jerusalem did not descend into the catastrophe many had expected. Accounts from the period describe efforts to secure the city and manage the transfer of power. Prisoners were released. Negotiated agreements were honored. And while suffering and displacement remained unavoidable realities of medieval warfare, the feared massacre never materialized. The contrast was impossible to ignore. Nearly 90 years earlier, Jerusalem had changed hands amid extraordinary violence. Now it changed hands again under very different circumstances. Word spread rapidly throughout the region. Many were astonished. Others were relieved. And for Saladin, the moment became central to his reputation. Victory alone would have made him famous. The manner of that victory made him legendary. As the transition continued, Muslim banners appeared across the city. For the first time in generations, Jerusalem was once again under Muslim rule. Across the Islamic world, celebrations erupted. A dream that had survived nearly a century had finally been fulfilled. Rulers had pursued it. Armies had died for it. Generations had hoped for it. Now it was reality. For Saladin himself, however, the conquest represented more than a military achievement. It was the culmination of years spent unifying territories, building alliances, and preparing for a moment many believed would never come. The holy city had been recovered, but the story was larger than Jerusalem alone, because the fall of the city did not simply mark the end of one campaign. It transformed the balance of power across the Middle East. The Crusader kingdom had not disappeared entirely, but it had suffered a blow from which it would never fully recover. And news of Jerusalem's loss was already racing toward Europe. Their kings, nobles, and religious leaders were about to hear something they never expected. Jerusalem was gone. The city they had controlled for nearly 90 years had fallen, and the reaction would shake the Christian world. Soon, a new crusade would be called, and some of the most famous rulers in Europe would prepare for war. The fall of Jerusalem in 1187 was more than a military victory. It was the end of nearly 90 years of Crusader rule over one of the most contested cities on earth. For the Islamic world, the city's recovery became one of the defining achievements of the age. For Europe, it was a shock. News of Jerusalem's loss spread rapidly across the continent. Kings, nobles, and church leaders reacted with alarm. Soon, calls for a new crusade began to echo throughout Christendom. The result would become known as the Third Crusade. Among those who answered the call were some of the most powerful rulers of the medieval world, including Richard the Lionheart. The struggle between Saladin and the Crusaders was far from over. Yet even as new wars approached, Saladin's reputation continued to grow, not only because he won, but because of how he won. Centuries later, both Muslim and Christian writers would remember him as one of the most respected leaders of the medieval era, a commander capable of defeating his enemies, and a ruler capable of showing restraint when victory was finally his. Today, Jerusalem remains one of the most important cities in the world. Its walls, streets, and holy sites still attract millions of visitors every year. And more than 8 centuries later, the events of 1187 continue to fascinate historians. Because the story was never just about a city, it was about perseverance, a dream carried across generations, a kingdom that believed it could never lose Jerusalem, and a leader who changed the course of history when he finally reclaimed it. For nearly 90 years, the holy city seemed beyond reach. Then Saladin arrived, and the world changed.